Hi. I just thought I'd share a quick presentation on the subject of psychotic or dissociachotic. I'm really keen on Mental Health Week to be part of offering an alternative to the dominant narrative. And although there's many wonderful things happening, it seems to me that they're all built on the old stories. So I just wanted to offer something quickly on psychotic and dissociachotic, or dissociachotic, and look at culture, spirit, and meaning, touch on the wounded healer. And because I'm a mental health nurse, I wanted to talk about some of the beautiful theories in mental health nursing that actually would mean that we probably wouldn't see much psychosis if we offered those approaches. And, there'll be other disciplines and professions that'll have other ideas. So I think one of the things that'll happen is if we begin to offer an alternative approach is that we will accidentally demythologize what we've been told. And of course, what we've been told is how we run systems, it's how we run services, it's how everything is set up, how all the funding has worked. Of course, there's small organisations that do things independently, but broadly speaking, we do this thing. And R.D. Laing pointed it out rather well, is that sanity, as we call it, kind of non-madness, is determinism and totalitarianism. It is death to the soul and the end of freedom. So what he's saying is that within insanity, we can move away from determinism and totalitarianism. So the labels of the psychotic disorders offer a determinism that we've got to see someone only reaching a limit of potential or a limit of the edge of their so-called disease or disorder. And the totalitarianism is exactly what I was saying. It's the systems and structures that are built on in government and further afield, and funding and resources are built on the mythology of mental illness as we know it. Now, I'm not saying people aren't getting distressed, people aren't overwhelmed. Of course, there's a human experience in there, but the disorder language that we use creates a totalitarianism as a structure of how we see people. And really, that's what we call sanity. Many of us think it's quite insane. It's quite insane because once upon a time I was sat in a situation and a system that said I was quite mad. And of course, now I have a really beautiful life shown here with my amazing family. And I just, conjures up an image in me that, had I talked about the life I have now when I was stuck in psychiatric institutions on 4 psychotropic medications, being given ECT, and you know, it, it would have sounded quite mad to think I had the life I have now. So why is this important? Well, to think about the life that we can have if we remove determinism and totalitarianism is also to think about whether we see psychosis or whether we see dissociachotic responses to adversity and threat in relationship. So do we see a disease or do we see a human being? And this is a quote from Pavon and Bayes: the degree to which we health professionals engage in dehumanization depends critically on the professional's conceptualization of schizophrenia, namely biogenetic or psycho-environmental. And of course, we can fluff around the edges and say, well, not all psychosis is schizophrenia, etc., etc. That's true. But in the deterministic and totalitarian structures that we have, they become interchangeable. And as the DSM has reduced the strength of idea of how we achieve a diagnosis, these language becomes interchangeable. And the dehumanization happens in this study where when we don't see someone as human, the same as us, we're more quick to able to shackle them, to inject them, to detain them. And the other study that goes with this, Arn and Leibowitz talks about, we have a reduced empathy if we see people as biogenetically ill rather than suffering from experiences in a psycho-environmental environment that was unsuitable to their well-being. And that's a really basic issue. So if we think about the threads of culture, spirit, and meaning, we've got the incredible work of Phil Borges in the Crazy Wise film, where he talks about his human rights work and how people were often seen as healers or visionaries in moments of distress as they emerged through their life. And often celebrated in small and remote cultural communities who saw the opportunity and idea of emergence and gift to the whole community. as something to celebrate, rather than in our culture, when we in our culture, in Western white culture, what we often see when people get distressed or hear voices or have visions, or we see that they're a problem, a burden, and a drain on our society. So when we go to deep cultural meaning, we can be more creative and available to the breakthroughs and the importance of someone's reality and experience. On the bottom left-hand side, we've got the Spiritual Emergence Network. And what it just reminded me to think about, saying that it may or may not be a spiritual emergence, a spiritual breakthrough, but taking into account a person's spirit, spirituality, beliefs, traditions, experience of the world is vital when we want to understand why something has become overwhelming or too much for a person. And these two things, culture and spirit, are really at the heart of how we can understand meaning. And on the right hand side, I've just got this idea of connection and coexisting. So if we can be in connection with people's culture and spirit, we can coexist in the world with them. What we're creating is a space for love, coexistence, and connection. And the person's so-called madness in white Western culture, which I would argue would lead to an unmadness. So the thread of human connection in culture, spirit, and meaning is vital. Then we think about the thread of human connection and the wounded healer, and you can see the picture of me and my sister in the top corner, a rather archetypal position of a nice white Western safe dominant discourse family, the trees in the background, bicycles, everything we wanted. But of course, it didn't tell the whole story, and perhaps along the way there was some wounding that happened until we get to the picture in the bottom left-hand corner, where there's me being quite mad in our language and psychotic. And one of the great gifts that came along the way of my healing journey was those moments when people would invite me to be normal, and in this case, holding a baby despite being seen to be quite mad and psychotic. You know, it was a real gift of healing. And it was those things that I picked up on the way. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got Iapix, who is a sort of Greek mythological character, perhaps the brother of Icarus. And his story came out of Apollo, the god, wanting to offer him prophecy and wisdom and skill, and him turning his back on that and instead saying, actually, there's people around me who are suffering. I would like to dedicate myself to healing. And I think this is often what comes out of being alongside someone who's suffering ourselves, is that it becomes a very natural idea to learn from what's happened to us, the good and the bad, and then offer that to somebody else. It's not to say that it's all plain sailing, but it's a beautiful thing. And in the top right-hand corner, just my favorite thing to think about, you know, are mad people mad amongst mad people? And I think that what we find is that often mad people aren't that mad amongst other mad people. It's when they come into contact with the so-called sane people that madness emerges. And that's a big part of the story of understanding what we call psychosis, but as a dissociachotic state, a state in response to threat from other human beings. So noticing that we're not mad amongst other mad people is important. So the thread of human connection in mental health nursing, we've got the beautiful image of the white heart, which is the symbol of the International Nursing Council. And then I've just picked out three characters and books here. One is Hildegard Peplau, one is Joyce Travelby, and the bottom in the right-hand corner is Gertrude Schwing, who talked about the journey to the soul of the mentally ill. And although the language is uncomfortable, it was written in 1940, and she was simply talking about being in connection, being in human relationship, sharing all of me with all of the person. And in that safe space, people emerge from the so-called psychosis. Equally, Joyce Travelby in interpersonal aspects of nursing was saying that, you know, rapport wasn't something on the mental state examination, that bizarre structure of judging and assessing somebody that we use in the modern era in many clinical disciplines. Rather, rapport was about one human being in connection to another. And of course, Hildegard Peplau talked about the psychodynamics and the interpersonal relationship as being vital, both as an education for both the nurse and the person in distress and the broader communities. as well as the kind of key to people being able to move through the wounds of the past that have brought them to this state. So I think it's important that mental health nursing takes some responsibility. We've had a checkered history at our origin, but we emerged into these incredible theorists that offers us an alternative. And sadly, currently, what are we looking at? We're looking at us being handmaidens, broadly speaking, to medical decisions by doctors, which in our dominant discourse primarily includes diagnosis, medication, incarceration, and that kind of custodian role. But we have an incredible guiding light that was about human connection in some of these theorists. And I'm sort of imploring us as mental health nurses to return to that. So, what does that talk about? The wisdom of spirit and culture in meaning, the wisdom of the wounded healer, and the wisdom of some human to human relational nursing theorists. Well, it leads us to understand dissociachotic quite well. Dissociachotic, the experience of animation and giving life to being at variance of companionship to self. So there's an animated way that we split off from ourselves, from companionship to self, in order for the survival of self, so that I survive in relationship to interpersonal threat from others. So when there's a threat from another person, probably in the here and now, that represents threats in my life, I'm going to split off from myself and essentially dissociate. But dissociachotic is explaining why psychosis is a form of dissociation, for want of a better way of describing it. I'm not seeking to pathologize it in any way. Why is it important? Well, the perception, as you'll see in the vase and face, is that it's very hard to hold both images at once. And once we both think we've got both, we switch between one and the other. And that's because the outlines of the shape are the same. And I'm borrowing that metaphor for the field of psychosis and understanding how so-called psychosis emerges in the sort of psycho-environmental threat from other humans. And how we don't understand it because we think that dissociation is a kind of shutdown response. But in this position, dissociachotic is saying it's just simply a way of helping us to understand that although we know that people who experience so-called psychosis have a lot of adversity and threat from others, we don't really believe that, but because we've been told it's a biological disease state, which has never been demonstrated to be particularly accurate or true. Whilst I'm not disputing that there's processes in the body and biology happening, it's not a disease, as would be sort of perpetuated by the kind of totalitarian position of our systems. So we need to understand the metaphor of not being able to hold both the traumatizer or a person facing threat from another and the biologically diseased state person, and not just switch to the dominant discourse of the biological disease state, but remember to say, actually there's another picture here, there's another story here. I just don't recognize it. But that's not a reason to fall into the dominant discourse. So I want to relate it to polyvagal theory. What I'm suggesting is that as the threat from the other and social engagement between me and the other person is not able to be maintained because the threat is too difficult, I go into the mobilization and the immobilization response. And again, just to bring it up, the immobilization response that includes dissociation is not thought of to be this busy, active process of psychosis, so-called, and that's what I'm going to try and explain. So dissociation is a freeze response. We have an animal, we have a human. This is when the sort of reptilian brain is dominant, very little development of the mammalian brain and the ability to distinguish and discern and process skillfully. So there was animals, there was humans, and you have to allow a little bit of poetic license. But essentially the animal chased the human needed to kill the animal to eat. He would try and fight it. If the animal was too big, the human would run away. If the animal was too fast, the human would play dead. And this is the poetic license bit. The animal would leave because its innate response was to chase down its prey and before it ate it. So then we had to adapt. We developed the mammalian brain, the ability to perceive, be more skillful in the moments of how we manage different situations, consciously and unconsciously, of course. And then the threat changed as well. So the threat is now from a human. If we try and fight a human in our society, that doesn't work terribly well. Broadly speaking, we get arrested, or in the psychiatric system, we get detained. So we try and run away. Same. not a lot of ability to get away from humans in the modern world. So that as the human threat has evolved into making sure people can't run away or be distracted or whatever, so the human being has realized that's not an option. If we lie flat and dissociate in the sort of classic passive sense of playing dead, the human being is different from the animal as a threat, and the human being will come towards us and do things to us. So, whereby lying flat and as an unconscious process of dissociation and playing dead from the animal threat was legitimate because the animal's need was different. Here, the human brain has a nuanced understanding and realizes, that won't save me anymore because the threatening human will come further towards me. Therefore, it's developed the psychotic state. And in simplest terms, if you walk down the street and see people who are shouting at voices, seeing things, overwhelmed in these distressing so-called psychotic states, you'll probably walk around them. And it serves the same purpose, that is, to ensure people don't come too close to us. So, in summary, what I'm sort of talking about is that the dissociachotic state is a dissociative state, for want of a better language, whereby the human brain protects itself by creating distance from itself, but also, in this case with psychosis, creating distance from the threat of the other person, pushing them away so that they can re-find safety. It's an incredible skill, an incredible resource that we have. The importance of the language here is that this is not a new diagnosis or label. It's a reminder to other human beings, whether that's professionals, families and friends, loved ones, individuals themselves, that this is a functional, legitimate response. And actually what the person's saying is, there is a threat. Please, can that threat cease to be like that so that I can come back into connection myself and be in connection with the other person if needs be. I won't go through all of this, but it's really important because what we're essentially saying is that we're going to facilitate the person staying where they are or coming towards us, not going towards them. So what does that mean? The human being will try and save the person who's lying flat. And even in psychotic states, the mental health system decides it needs to control that. But what we're saying here is no, allow the person to come back into connection with us rather than us going further towards someone, pushing them further into liminality and therefore creating more increased need to look like what we currently call as psychotic. The support of the help of the loved one's then responsibility is to notice what the threat was. Perhaps was I going towards someone? Was I gesturing in a way that triggered a sense of threat? Was I pushing them into liminal states where they cease to exist as that kind of nihilistic space of ontological insecurity, as Lang talked about? And I need to notice what happened there so I can perhaps not stop what I'm doing, but certainly stop doing that more or invite the person to come back in. So I need to be able to attune, be available to know what I did in that moment. I'm no longer asking the so-called psychotic person to change, to be different, because I'm validating their experience and their reality and their expression as a really important, vital maneuver by them. And in doing that, the responsibility comes back to me, the person that may have created this environment of threat, this psycho-environmental threat. And also recognizing, oh, look, this comes and goes, it fluctuates, it moves. This is not a biological disease state. The bottom line then here is that what we're seeking to do is to be with the person. When we develop what the threats were, we can see the differences that we have, and then therefore we can move into the coexisting space, the coexisting experience, which is where we have different realities. We can both see them, and we allow one another to know that although I didn't mean to be threatening, the other person found it threatening, and vice versa. And in that, we can come into a coexisting same experience. And this is where the evaporation of the so-called psychotic state will happen. And it's there that we can start to share this more intentionally, and the stories can emerge. And in that connection, the narrative, the human understanding towards authoring or re-authoring our narratives in our life can evolve. And we can move away from the ideas of labels, confinement, medication. Because the question must then be, why would we seek to confine, label or medicate a very legitimate response to threat in the human relationship? So just to bring it back together, what I'm really talking about is a sense of allowing people to be in their incredible spiritual, cultural, meaningful state, creating connection through the broad range of the wounded healer and the helper, who themselves is often likely to be a wounded healer, of course, and allowing that connection to evolve in our states of being. And in that experience, we'll see a non-psychosis. Um, and we've moved away from needing to label, needing to target, needing to eradicate, needing to medicate, needing to create this totalitarian system whereby one size fits all, biological disease states thrive, and instead we move to a state of, wow, what happened between you and me that meant that you very legitimately and skillfully protected yourself? Uh, and thanks, even, we might even begin to be grateful to realize that this incredible opportunity exists for us both to feel safer, both to feel more connected. And despite the fear that if, when I see another person looking what I've traditionally thought of as psychotic, that must mean I could be psychotic. Now I realize that within the human relationship, when we take care, when we move away from goals, when we move away from towards right understanding, deep understanding, we actually move towards a space of coexisting experience and non-psychosis. Some of you will agree, some of you won't agree, but this is a working idea now of how we can move away from this rather weak, poor, and thoroughly unsubstantiated diagnostic construct towards a more human, connected model of compassion and connection. Thanks so much for listening.